you write that Joe Biden was right when he called Putin's actions unjustified. He was wrong when he called them unprovoked. So we've been talking about this a bit, but can you just explain why that is?
Yeah, I think that regardless of the horrific foreign policy of this country over so many decades, the wars we have created, occupations, overthrowing governments, there still is no legitimacy for what Putin has done and is doing right now in leading his country into war in Ukraine. Uh, if we're serious, though, about figuring out how to end it, figuring out how to make diplomacy happen sooner and stronger and get to the end of this thing, it's really important to understand the motivations of people on the other side. And in this case, I think that we really do have to understand what those provocations were. The provocations against Russia didn't come particularly from just from Ukraine, but came from the United States and NATO. And it all had to do with the threat that Ukraine, a key country surrounding Russia, one of the most important sort of economic components, a strategic and military support, was threatened, a major threat to Russia, by the notion that it might join NATO. And the reality is, for a decade or more, the US and other countries, the European leaders, have all said quietly and privately, there's no way that Ukraine is coming into NATO. But there have been occasions in the past when they did say that it was. And most recently, in 2008, at the NATO summit in Bucharest, they actually passed the resolution that was passed by all 30 heads of state who were there. Article 23 says explicitly, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agreed today that these countries will become members of NATO. So it was very specific and very clear. That, I think, goes very far to the kind of outrage that Putin was reacting to, and that others in Russia believe as well. It's not the only reason, we should be clear about that, but it is one of the kind of provocative pokings at Russia that had been going on since the end of the Cold War, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the US trying to assert its own role as the sole superpower. And it's in that context that this crisis has emerged. Again, this does not make it legitimate for Russia to be invading Ukraine. It simply doesn't. But it is important for us to understand that there is something behind it. It didn't just happen out of nowhere. So I think that component of the history is key. You know, one of the things that I think we forget sometimes is that how we understand history, how we understand current events, how we understand crises, has everything to do with when we start the clock. So even though there's, again, there's nothing legitimate about this, if we had started the clock back in 1997 or maybe even in 2008, we would be saying the most important thing to change right now is what the US and NATO are doing. If we start the clock in February of 2022, the most important thing is to focus on what Russia is doing and to stop it.
So what is to be done now, though, right? Because that's we're in the situation that we're in, and how should we be moving forward? I think a lot of people, and I'd love for both of you to speak to this, because I think there are a lot of people out there who legitimately think, wait, I like human rights. I want to protect lives and civilians, and one country is very powerful, the other country isn't. Shouldn't we be arming these people in this smaller country? There are obviously a lot of cynics out there who want to do that for terrible reasons, but I think there are some people who just don't get it. So could you guys kind of explain to people why this is not about protecting innocent lives, sending arms to Ukraine?
It certainly isn't. I think it has a lot to do with military budgets, with where money gets spent, what happens when countries join NATO. One of the things that happens is they start buying a lot more arms, mainly from the United States. That obviously plays a huge role here. But I think before we get to the question of arming, we have to get back to the question of diplomacy. There's not going to be a good outcome if this war continues as a constantly escalating war of more and more weapons being used in the country. It's simply going to lead to more dead Ukrainians and more
Right.
dead Russian soldiers. But I think we need to go back to the question of diplomacy. We need diplomacy that at some point will be used to end this war. The question is, how long will it go forward? How many people will have to die before we get there? Maybe something will happen tomorrow in these talks that are supposed to go forward on the border of Belarus. We don't know. But I think if we're serious about diplomacy, it has to include an immediate ceasefire. It has to include an immediate Russian pullback, pulling back its troops and tanks from Ukraine. And because diplomacy has to involve all sides giving something up, I think that there has to be a statement from NATO leaders saying in public what they have been willing to whisper in private, that there's no way Ukraine is coming into NATO anytime in the foreseeable future. And then there have to be real negotiations about what's going to be the military and security posture across Europe in terms of nuclear weapons, in terms of conventional weapons, getting back to the European-wide disarmament treaties that have been abandoned mainly by Trump in the last 4 years. So all of that is on the table for diplomacy, and that's what we desperately need.
Do you guys have any faith? I mean, what someone in the comments asked what we should be doing. Should people be out in the streets? What do you think is the best way to try to have any for the anti-war movement to deal with this?
I think that our movement, both in this country and globally, has been weakened in recent years, and it's coming back together on a kind of emergency basis. I think the demand needs to stay that we need diplomacy, but not war. But we need to make that more than a slogan. We need to have some information behind it. What should be on the negotiating table? Well, there should be negotiations over an immediate ceasefire, a Russian pullback, an end to weapons pouring in, acknowledging that Ukraine is not going to be joining NATO, negotiations over weapons agreements in terms of weapon systems and particular nuclear weapons across Europe. The introduction of the nuclear option into this war has made everything enormously more dangerous. It's a very unlikely scenario that could lead to an actual nuclear exchange between the two largest nuclear powers in the world. But the fact that it's not impossible makes this incredibly dangerous when the stakes are so enormously high. So all of that has to be on the table, and the anti-war movement, I think, we need to be able to keep both positions in our minds at the same time, that the US history is one of duplicity, one of lying about our own wars, one of overthrowing governments. All of that history has led us to understand how dangerous all those things are. And we have to be clear that what Russia is doing is completely unacceptable. So I know there are some in the movement who find it difficult to criticize the other side because our government has been so consistently in the wrong for so many wars, so many attacks, so many occupations around the world since the end of the Cold War and during the Cold War. But this time, we have to recognize that right now, this danger of the Russian invasion and Russian potential occupation of Ukraine is the primary point in this war. So we have to be focused on that as well. And keeping the focus on, I think there is room for protests in the street, but I think we also have a huge amount of educational work to do.
Yeah.
So the teach-ins, the webinars, all of that is still really, really important.
Well, the two